What is Linux's relationship to the GNU project?
Well, there's relationships to GNU on kind of multiple levels. One is just the philosophical level of thinking that making your source open is a good idea. There's a lot of these programs done by the Free Software Foundation and done by other people like Linux, and there's a symbiosis between Linux and the programs, so that the programs run on Linux and at the same time, and they take advantage of Linux as a platform, while Linux takes advantage of the programs by just being able to use them.
What programs?
For the main one is actually the GNU C compiler, which without a C compiler it would not have been possible to make Linux or most of the open programs available. Linux uses the GPL, and I agree with the kind of philosophy behind the GPL. That said, the GPL itself is not a very pretty document, which is probably just because no lawyers can ever be very pretty.
Some people advocate that it be described as GNU/Linux. I mean, what's your thought on that? Is that justified, or?
Well, I think it's justified, but it's justified if you actually make a GNU distribution of Linux. The same way that I think that Red Hat Linux is fine, or SUSE Linux, or Debian Linux. Because if you actually make your own distribution of Linux, you get to name the thing. But calling Linux in general GNU Linux, I think, is just ridiculous.
I have disagreed violently with the Free Software Foundation because the classic case we had 10 plus years ago of that was TiVo. They tried to do the same thing. They failed at it. They didn't lock it down quite well enough, but they basically tried very hard enough to make it inconvenient to change things around. And my thing to that was, I want the source code back. I don't want the control of the hardware you sell. To me, the GPL was always about, you can still make changes to the kernel. You can still take their improvements, which weren't actually all that significant, and run it on your own machine, right? And that was always true even with TiVo. While the FSF felt that they locked the hardware down, so now you can make changes to that particular piece of hardware, and you can update that particular piece of hardware anymore, so it was evil. And I was like, but that's the hardware they're selling. That's not the software. You can still change the software. You just can't update it on that particular piece. So this is a fairly fundamental disagreement, and it's the fundamental disagreement that caused the whole GPL version 3 split, which was saying, we disagree so fundamentally on this that I can never use GPL v3 because the way you wrote the GPL v3 was explicitly to stop this thing that I thought was okay, and was in fact part of the whole contract with people that you can use Linux any way you want. If any way you want includes saying, you can't change it on this machine, that's fine. I mean, an extreme case of not changing it on this machine is actually burning it on a ROM and just making it physically impossible to change. And I'm okay with that too. And surprisingly, the FSF is actually also okay with that. The FSF's position is that if nobody can change it, it's okay, right? But if somebody can change it, then everybody has to be able to change it. To me, that whole standpoint made no sense at all, and I actually think they're clinically insane, some of those people. And the FSF pushed very hard for GPL projects to upgrade to E3, to the point that I had some interaction with them that I felt dirty after talking to them. I felt like, wow, these guys are pushing drugs. License choice is, to me, something very important and sacred. And I personally think the version 3 changes were bad, but that's my personal choice, and my software doesn't use v3. But if somebody else uses v3, that's their choice, and they are the person who should make that choice. And once you do make the choice, and you think that I want my software to not be used in a situation where it gets locked down, then you should take people to court if they actually violate your license.
I, however, have to acknowledge that the people who coined the term open source as a reaction against the free software movement have done us a lot of harm. Until 1998, as our software, including the GNU/Linux operating system, spread, it made people aware of our ideas, not with 100% effectiveness, but sometimes it did. But in 1998, they coined the term open source to disconnect our software from our ethical ideas. And they were fairly effective at that. Since then, we have to work hard to teach people, even the users of our software, that there's such a thing as the free software movement, that it's a movement for their freedom, that this is not just a matter of more convenient, more reliable software. I mean, those are secondary desirable things, but they're not as important as freedom. Freedom is crucial.
Do you agree that you undermine GPL version 3, and how can we get you to stop?
What?
How can we get you to stop?
Oh, I hate GPL version 3. I undermined it on purpose. I actually thought the GPL version 3 extensions were horrible. I understand why people would want to do them, but I think it should have been a completely new license. My argument for liking version 2, and I still think version 2 is a great license, was that I give you source code, you give me your changes back, we're even, right? That's my take on GPL version 2, right? It's that simple. And version 3 extended that in ways that I personally am really uncomfortable with. Namely, I give you source code. That means that if you use that source code, you can't use it on your device unless you follow my rules. And to me, that's a violation of everything version 2 stood for. And I understand why the FSF did it, because I know what the FSF wants. But to me, it's not the same license at all. So I was very upset and made it very clear, and this was months before version 3 was actually published. There was discussion about this long before. There was an earlier version of version 3 years before, actually, where I said, no, this is not going to fly. And during that earlier discussion, I had already added to the kernel that, hey, I don't have the version 2 or later. And there was no, and I was really happy then when version 3 came out that I had done that something like 5 years before, because there was never any question about what the license for the kernel was. But I actually think version 3 is a fine license, right? I'm a firm believer in if you write your code, it is your choice to pick a license. And version 3 is a fine license. Version 3 was not a good, here, we give you version 2, and then we try to sneak in these new rules and try to force everybody to upgrade. That was the part I disliked. And the FSF did some really sneaky stuff.
There is now a second movement, the open source movement, where they consider only the practical benefits, and they refuse, and I mean that literally, they carefully avoid the issues of principle, freedom, ethics, and making a good society for people to live in.